What does success look like? Alcorn State University, Hines Community College Utica campus, Jackson State University, Mississippi Valley State University, Tougaloo College. With support from the Regional Educational Laboratory Southeast, HBCUs in Mississippi have formed a collective partnership to promote a unified, cultural-based approach to student success, to enhance institutional competitiveness, build research capacity, and increase students' readiness to compete regionally and nationally. What does success look like? Alcorn State University, Hines Community College Utica campus, Jackson State University, Mississippi Valley State University, Tougaloo College. Mississippi's HBCU Post-Secondary Success Research Alliance. Rigorous, policy and practice-relevant research and resources to inform initiatives and innovation. A network of partners to support access and success for traditionally underserved and underrepresented students. Strategic, evidence-based decision-making to promote student success. Innovation, impact, scale, sustainability, a competitive edge. We are better together.
Good morning, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to our evidence-based practices to enhance cultural competency in post-secondary setting session. I'm so glad that all of you could join us. I see all of my friends' faces and colleagues. We have an exciting session for you today. I shared that particular video today. Many of you have already seen it before. Many of you participated in the session that we had at the White House Initiative. One of the things that we're excited about today, this is about strategic planning. This is a series, actually the fourth of a series of trainings around culturally competency, but with the focus on strategic planning. And so we have with us today, Dr. Fred Seaman, who is an international expert on strategic planning and has worked well with many of our HBCUs across the nation. So we are in for a treat today. But before I even move forward with our discussion today, and you notice I said discussion, we want to think about the work that we're doing today in the context of the bigger picture. And so that is why today it's not a presentation. This is a discussion. This is our fourth session. We have been learning about culturally responsive practices, our body of work. For those of you that were not able to join us for our meeting last week, and you should have received the agenda, but if you looked at our agenda, you saw the massive amount of work that we were able to do since 2017. And so before we even move forward, I want to say thank you, because we could not have done this without any of you. As you know, and particularly as I look at the faces on here, all of our work has been co-conceptualized, co-developed, and co-disseminated with our partners. And so I want to say again, thank you. And as we look to today as an exciting day to talk about how does this all come together as we move forward to continue strategic planning. We're a small group today. And so I want to take a few minutes for us to briefly introduce ourselves, and I'll go through the screen so that everyone will at least have an opportunity to say hi. I do see a couple new faces, so excited to see those faces here present today. I will start with Dr. Donzel Lee, who has been instrumental in the work that we've done in so many capacities. So Dr. Lee, will you briefly introduce yourself today?
Okay, good morning, everybody. And thanks for joining us. I'm Donzel Lee, a retired former provost and interim president at Alcorn State University.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Dr. Kesey?
Good morning, everyone. Marquise Cassie, and I'm the academic dean at the Utica campus of Hines Community College.
Dr. Sherman?
Hello, good morning. My name is Dr. Timothy Sherman, and I serve as a faculty member at the prestigious Morris Brown College.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Johnson.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Anthony Johnson. I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs at Morris Brown College.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Kimberly Binion, am I pronouncing that right? My new faces at Morris Brown.
Yes, I'm a faculty member at Morris Brown College.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Smith? Dr. Smith is driving, so okay, she's unmuting.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Tabitha Smith from Alcorn State University. I'm the MAT coordinator at Alcorn State University. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Drive safely, Dr. Smith. Mr. Dexter Howard Jr.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dexter Howard Jr. I'm a former employee of Alcorn State University, but currently I'm an HR specialist with the Department of Veterans Affairs. And so I'm just happy to be able to log on today.
Thank you for being here. Mr. Jonathan Towns.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Towns on the Utica campus of Hines Community College, and I serve as the Dean of Career and Technical Education.
And we have, thank you, Mr. Towns. We have behind the scenes, Mr. Nathan Archer, who is our Director of Communication, who has been instrumental in our dissemination work and has just been an amazing support to our HBC Post-Secondary Success Partnership. So thank you, Mr. Archer, for being here. So I will jump right in, I think, with my sharing of my screen. So again, thank you all for being here today, and thank you for taking time to introduce yourselves. I would be remiss without saying, Morris Brown, we are glad to have you here joining us. So Provost Johnson, thank you so very much for having your faculty come and be with us today. And so we look forward to adding another institution on that presentation where we'll be saying Morris Brown as well. So again, thank you for being here. Again, our presenter, I'll be really able to say that. I'll be here to continue to frame our discussion, but really our showstopper today is Dr. Fred Seaman, who's here with us today. And as you all know, Dr. Tamara Bertrand-Jones, our associate professor here at Florida State University, has also been very instrumental in this work, particularly in sharing the evidence base with us around this topic. Also, as you know, Dr. Gilmer was not able to join us today, but he has also been instrumental in the work that we've been doing. And so we want to actually acknowledge him as well. So jumping right in to frame our discussion, again, this is about framing because we will be discussing as a group about how we think about this work moving forward. I'll go through the first set of slides relatively quickly because this is the 4 series, and we'll be able to jump right into the look forwards and the strategic planning pieces of the project itself. So again, this is our disclaimer. We don't, this is a national IES project. The work is supported and funded. Everything is free for your services, but we don't endorse or mandate or direct anyone to use any of the materials used today. So that's the disclaimer. But so I wanted to start, as I always do, as you know, with our logic model. So this is just the logic model for this particular project. The Culturally Responsive Project actually emerged from Alcorn State University. That was the institution that said, we need to talk about cultural competency. We need to talk about it, not so much in the context when we hear about cultural competence, we're thinking about it in terms of race, et cetera, but we need to talk about in the context of gender, in the context of age, as our population, as we're being far and far more removed. Our faculty, our administrators are far and far more removed from our student population in terms of age. So that's what's a little bit different about this particular project. But if you see, I like to start with the end in mind. The long-term outcome really is about how do we enhance our knowledge to improve cultural competency. And we say for administrators and faculty, but it's really about our entire process, the institutional process. So we take an integrated approach. And hopefully, as we create these campuses that are more culturally responsive, we see increased outcomes in completion, retention, et cetera, for our students. And last but not least, once we continue to engage in these discussions and talk about the work that we're doing and how we enhance cultural competency, we want to disseminate. One of the things that we'll talk about at the end of this process and the end of the session today is the importance of taking what we've learned. We know that we do well as HBCUs. We do darn well as it relates to engaging and supporting and graduating diverse student populations. And so one of the things that we want to think about deeply is thinking about how do we continue to strategically plan and to broaden that impact and then tell the lessons learned of how we do it. So that's our long-term outcomes. And of course, again, this has been a series of activities. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here again in this piece because it situates and frames us, but we just say, why cultural competency? Well, we know culturally engaging environments is positively correlated with sense of belonging, academic self-efficacy, motivation, and intent to persist and performance. And so we know that it's important that we are culturally competent. As we think about the definitions, these are definitions from the research base that we've centered and anchored the work on throughout the sessions. And we talk about in context of having the ability to successfully teach students to come from different cultures other than our own, mastering certain personal and interpersonal awareness and sensitivities. And we think about it, we like to always think about becoming culturally competent in the context of understanding of having this knowledge base about cultural diversity. We have skills to communicate, to respond, and then we have a sense, and I think almost most importantly, this idea of being aware, awareness and concern for diverse learners. And so in our context, we know that cultural competency, and we talked about cultural competency in the context of K-12 and post-secondary settings, but really there's a bigger push. And what we're here to talk about today is how do we employ this from an institutional framework? And our key conceptualizations is not just about individual students or individual faculty, but about institutions as a whole. So we want to think about this in terms of an integrated approach. And again, I want us to think more broadly about not just our own institutions, but how do we think about disseminating and what does this mean if we wanted to scale up what we do well and find areas where we can improve to scale up to other institutions or to disseminate more broadly. And so we want to make the connections to our post-secondary and our institutional context. When we think about cultural competency in the context of the classroom, we think about it in terms of awareness, again, beliefs, biases, and how it may affect our teaching and how we view diverse students. Our knowledge base, on ensuring that we bring in different cultures and how it may affect our worldviews, and how can we bring those things into our teaching and learning processes. So when we think about cultural competency and what we're talking about in the context of culture, but also age, how do we take the information, what do our students bring to the table, and knowing what they bring in their diversity, and how do we actually engage that and embed that into our learning processes? And last but not least, how do we teach, communicate, and behave in the classroom with diverse students in a culturally congruent fashion? So these are things that we've talked about over a series of sessions in terms of awareness, knowledge, and skills. We'll now briefly talk about it in the context of this broader institutional context. So when we think about, we've been using UCS and we've been using this particular framework throughout the process to talk about his framework about culturally engaging campus environments. And so, of course, we talk about the external influences, we talk about the pre-college inputs that students bring, their academic dispositions, the preparation, but then we look at the bigger picture, ensuring that as we develop engaging campus environments, there's these components that we should be thinking about. And so we're talking about opportunities for meaningful cross-cultural engagement, validating environments, humanized educational environments, all things in which really inform our overall institutions and what they look like in terms of processes. One of the things we've been talking about, so you see here these three bullets. So these three bullets have been the series of sessions we've done. So we talked about the tenets of culturally sensitive instruction. We talked about the evidence base. We talked about what that looks like in the context of faculty assessment and development. We've also talked about structures and systems of support to actually implement and to do and have these culturally responsive environments. And today we want to talk about the strategic planning and the continuous improvement that we can use to ensure that we are actually creating these environments.
Dr. Lampkin, before you
Yes,
leave,
sir.
can I make a point here?
Yes, and you
Yeah.
can make a point throughout. And we're at a stopping point to have our colleagues to also talk about this.
Yeah. And you know, and we do a lot of work for colleges and universities, and one of the things that I stress, and particularly in our institutions, is the how critically important it is to create a certain kind of environment that consistently engage students in a way that meets their needs, so that you can achieve that student success at the end of their matriculation. And in today's environment, we have a much more diverse student population coming into our institutions. You know, several years ago, cultural competency is, for the most part, meant people of color. That's no longer the case, no longer the case. And so part of what we need to be sensitive to is unconscious bias and how that impacts the overall environment. And that environment is critical, because not only do you get student success by creating a certain kind of environment, you also get graduates who become good alumni, which is extremely important for our institutions. And one of the things that I stress with all of our institutions, you start creating good alumni when they're freshmen. And everything that happens from the time a student enters your doors until the time they leave will determine what kind of alumni they are on the back end. And from my perspective, the only kind of alumni that really count are what I call 3P alumni: proud, participating, and paying. Proud, participating, and paying. And too many of our institutions, and I tend to be brutally frank and honest, we've got alumni that will come to our football games, go to our classics, wear the colors, but won't get an institution a quarter. And that's a dynamic that we need to change.
Dr. Stephen, thank you so much for interjecting in that piece on multiple aspects. One, this diversity and how diverse our student population has become. But second, very fitting, as we all know that we are in football season, homecoming time. And so this is a very, you bring it back full circle in terms of our alumni and our campus environments and what those look like. I think this is also a good time. I was going to take us to the next slide to talk about this, but let's take a minute and we're going to continue to engage in this discussion to talk about how our institutions, even before we start talking about the strategic planning that we're doing, what are we already doing, or what do we think we're doing well, or where do we think we might be able to improve as it relates to this broader context of cultural, being culturally competent and culturally responsive. This is the discussion, colleagues, so that we can identify these things and share out more broadly with others. Anyone want to jump in right now? Or then I can put on my teacher hat and then we can start to identify folk that I know are doing some amazing things because I've been on your campuses.
Okay, I can chime in if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
One of the things that institutions should certainly be aware of or ask themselves is, do we have structures in place? And again, this was one of our previous discussions. Do we have structures in place such that when that student comes in, he or she perceives those structures to be there, understands that those structures are there, and is comfortable with the environment? And as Dr. Faison just said, I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name.
Yeah, that's okay.
Just said, students need to be able to feel that comfort from the time they step on our campus until the time they walk across that stage to receive that degree. The other piece is that institutions have to be intentional in terms of cultural sensitivity, and institutions have to be intentional in that they provide the resources to make the environment a comfortable environment. As I mentioned earlier, I am now retired, and we have a new, young, and dynamic president at Alcorn. But one of the more recent developments is the opening of a women's center at Alcorn to address contemporary women's issues. But we also have in place a very consistent and active multicultural office, which provides ongoing activities and services for students. We receive a number of students, international students, for example, particularly from Africa, and so even though they look like us, their culture is different, and so we have to make arrangements to make those students comfortable as well. And the other thing that I like is that office coordinates with a number of other programs, and I'm thinking especially of the Ag program, which does some international work, and together they are able to provide opportunities and services for to promote diversity on our campus. So I think the main point that I want to make is that institutions need to be intentional in providing opportunities and services for students, for all students.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. I think you bring up two very important points, the structures and supports, and giving us specific examples of what those structures and supports look like. Another very important point that you've noted is particularly as it relates to our international students and the fact that just because they look like us, they come from a different culture, and being aware of that and being responsive to that. So those are really key areas as we think about the work that we're doing, particularly at our HBCUs, that we should be mindful of. So thank you so very much for sharing that. Others, before we get into the strategic planning piece, I'm sure there's at least one other colleague that would like to share.
Good morning again, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can, Dr. Kesey.
Great. Just to piggyback, I love the use of the word intentional, Dr. Lee. To me, that really signifies that the community, the college, the students, the faculty, everyone is vested when you use intentional measures. One thing at Hines we do well is we can come up with some wonderful ideas and mechanisms for supporting our students. One of the most recent ones to come out is a service we have called Wingmen. And what it is we've hired our full-time faculty, we have some adjunct support, and all they do is track our students. So they look inside of their Canvas platform and the response rate to, how often are you logging into classes? How are you participating? What are your grades looking like? So this service is really just kind of a tracking mechanism. But even in light of that, sometimes the Wingman service still misses those students who really need an intervention. So yes, we come up with these wonderful practices, but then how do we actually, provide that continuous improvement that we were speaking of? I love the fact that you're saying as soon as that student steps on the campus, they become, a valued alumnus of that institution. For us, because we have dual credit students, it actually begins long before they even get to our campuses.
Mhm.
And if that experience as a dual credit student is negative or if it's unfavorable, we've already impressioned on that student that Hines is not a location that I want to be bothered with. If our admissions office can't provide those wraparound services to get that application done, to accept those documents from the parents, from the students, from the school, it becomes so tedious sometimes. I know that we have to stay accountable, but we as cultural competent leaders, we need to understand that some school systems operate totally different from others. And I think at Hines, we really need to open those conversations a little bit better. We have 5 locations that work cohesively for that effort, but every population is different. And these conversations, we have to kind of continue this. As the HBCU campus, we do our best, but we have PBI campuses that also work into this model. And so that's my goal, I guess, with this partnership, is to be able to take what I'm learning and all of your valuable information and share that with my colleagues and hope they'll listen. So I definitely appreciate your comments today, Dr. Seaman and Dr. Lee.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keatsy. I cannot say I was hoping that Hines would speak up, because we know that there's some intentionality that is definitely happening at that institution. But you also make a very good point in terms of this idea even prior to them coming and being fully enrolled into the campus. So that's really very insightful as we think about the work. Dr. Seaman, is there something you'd like to share before we
Oh, no, cool.
Okay. All right, so we're
Just to
gonna
piggyback that, we were excited. We did experience our homecoming last week at Hines. And we invited in high school students from 3 of our area, schools, and the energy that they brought to the campus was so magnificent. And my thought was, even before we invited them, we need to make sure these students know that we can take care of them. That's that intentional service, Dr. Lee, that I appreciate. We didn't have college support. So what we had to do is, as a campus community, we pooled our resources, our personal resources, to make sure these students were treated with that engagement that we're always talking about. We have to address that. The college, again, has their focus, but when those students come to our campus, they are in our care. And I think that makes the distinction with the HBCU mindset. We take care of ours when they come to us. So intentional. I love that word. I'm going to start using that a little bit more purposefully.
Thank you, Dr. Key. So that's exciting. We're in FAMU's having their homecoming this week. So that's really, and I like the idea of engaging the high school students as well very early on. So that is exciting. So when we think about how do we think about this continuous improvement process, I'm going to talk about and turn it over to Dr. Seaman to talk to us about this actual process of strategic planning. And I like this quote. I use this quote a lot because it says, a good wind is no use to a sailor who doesn't know his direction. And so that's what strategic planning does for us. And as we turn it over to Dr. Seaman, he's going to help us get some tools to help us get some direction moving forward. So here we go. So making connections, strategic planning. Dr. Seaman, let me know when you'd like for me to just flip the slides, okay?
Okay. First of all, good morning, everybody. I'm extremely excited to be joining you all for a conversation about strategic planning this morning. And not just saying that because that's what you're supposed to say when you do one of these, but extremely excited about it. And Dr. Lampton, the phrase that I always use is, if you don't know where you're going, any plan will do.
Right.
Yeah.
Dr. Seaman, before you continue, I don't know how to, but Mr. Archer, there's a few people waiting in the waiting room that I don't know how to do it because my screen is sharing. Can we let them in, please?
Absolutely, I got them.
Thank you.
Let me say just a couple of things before we get into the slides. First thing I would say to you is that I've actually been on all of your campuses, at least once and 2 or 3 times on a couple of them. And I have some Mississippi roots. My wife is from Batesville, Mississippi, up in the Delta. When Ray Mavis was governor, we did a project for the governor's office where we completely reorganized state government in Mississippi. So I've spent a lot of time all over the state. I've also spent some time on Morris Brown campus since they also represent here. So again, very, very pleased to be with you all. And the first thing I would say to you is that, you know, planning is nothing extraordinary in some regards. And quite frankly, it's something that most of us do on a regular basis. In fact, you wouldn't be on this call if you had not planned to be here. And those who are not on the call, they plan not to be here. and so it's something most of us do on a very regular basis. And I want to put emphasis on most of us, other than my 3 allegedly adult children who just let life happens, you know, and there's some folks, that's part of the diversity that we've got. Yeah. But there's several reasons that I talk candidly with organizations about why do a strategic plan. And one of the first things I talk about, and it gets at helping direct resources and efforts, but more than anything else, it helps you to build some consensus around priorities. What are the most strategic priorities an institution, a department, or even a unit must address in order to get from point A to point B? And on a college and university campus, those priorities ought to ultimately result in student success, some kind of way. That ought to be the ultimate outcome of all of our priorities, whether it's at the institutional level, department level, unit level. And if those priorities don't result in student success, you're missing an opportunity, to be perfectly honest with you. And you're probably doing your students a disservice, to be brutally candid and honest about it. And then the other thing that I would say to you is that, you know, in any organization, a lot of things can be important, but everything can't be a priority. And particularly a priority that you wrap resources and budget and time and effort around. Yeah, and there are several criteria that I use to help organizations shape priority. One is something that I call value. The value of a priority relative to ultimately creating student success. Another priority I use is practicality. To what extent is addressing this priority and developing goals and strategies and action steps and budget around it practical in your real world? You know, priorities shouldn't be pie in the sky. And then a third criteria that I use is something that's called acceptability. To what extent would this be acceptable to the troops on the ground that are really going to have to make it happen? And that is critically important. To what extent is it going to be acceptable to the troops on the ground that's really going to have to do the heavy lifting to actually make it happen? And then the last criteria that I typically use is something that I call return on investment. And for me, that's simply, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is the juice worth the squeeze? So that for me, that sort of helps the context about, you know, why we do this. But it's also these other things that you see here. goals align with the institution's vision for the future. And for me, vision is simply, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up some more? What do you want to be when you grow up some more? If you've got a 5-year strategic plan or 10-year strategic plan, and if you can achieve that vision in the 5 years of a plan, 10 years of a plan, I will tell you very brutally and honestly, your vision isn't broad enough. It's not broad enough. It's not big enough. It's not BHAG enough. If you can achieve your vision in 5 years, you need to find another vision, because that ought to be a stretch kind of deal. But also, you want to use the strategic planning process to help build some consensus around what makes you so unique and special. And for our institutions, that's critical in today's environment, because it's a much more competitive higher education marketplace. I'm a proud Bethune-Cookman College graduate. I haven't got to the point where I can say Bethune-Cookman University yet. So I graduated from BCC. And when I first went to college, which was quite a while ago, you know, it was a foregone conclusion that I was going to HBCU. That wasn't a question. For me, all my classmates, we were going to Cookman, we were going to FAMU, we were going to Southern, we were going to Howard, but we were going to HBCU. That is no longer the case. That is no longer the case. So we've got to be in a position where we can sell what we've got about why we're unique, why we're special, in order to compete. And you know, what's interesting about today's, and I tend to be brutally candid and honest, what's interesting about today's students is that they come to an institution with an entirely different set of expectations about the learning environment and what they're going to get while they're on campus. When I was at Cookman, hey, we were happy to get hot water in the shower on a regular basis. But today's students, some of them come from high schools where the facilities, the equipment, the IT and everything else is better than what's on some of our campuses. And that's a dynamic that, you know, that quite frankly, we need to change in order to be more competitive. But more than anything else, a plan ought to be that, you know, living document. It shouldn't be something static, but in order for it to become a living document, it has to get implemented and executed. That's where some institutions fall short. In the last, 3-4 years, I've helped Virginia State University, Norfolk State University, Fort Valley State University with their strategic plans. Currently working on Florida A&M's University strategic plan for the second time, working on the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff strategic plan for the second time. And 3 of those institutions that I've worked with, they've put a structure, operations, and processes in place to make implementation happen. And if you don't have a structure, operations, processes, and systems to make implementation happen, all you got is some paper. So those are extremely, extremely important. And then the last thing on there is you got to measure and monitor, and that needs to be part of the implementation process. I'm a very firm believer that what gets measured gets done. What gets measured gets done. And you've got to have some ownership of benchmarks and milestones. Folks need to know where the buck stops, who's accountable, all of those kinds of things. Yeah. Does that make semi-good sense on a Thursday morning? Yeah, okay. Cool. And folks, please don't hesitate to stop, ask questions, and and whatnot. Let's go to the next one, Dr. Lampkin. Yeah, this is a pretty basic and standard strategic planning process that you can actually use at the institutional level. You can use it at the department level. You can even use it at the unit level. And what we've typically recommended is you have to put a lot into preparation. And in that regard, you want to really hone in on what is it do we really want out of the strategic planning process. And what I typically suggest, start with the end in mind. In fact, one of the questions that I always put to organizations is, what would you like to be true when we finish the strategic planning process that's not true today about the institution? What would you like to be true that's not true now? And so we use that as a framework for putting some parameters together. Typically, there are work groups, committees that are put together to help, that we work with to help guide and direct the process. We do an assessment kind of thing, and that assessment is the process is designed to start where the institution is, not where we think it ought to be. Start where the institution is, not where we think it should be. And that involves looking at data. I'm a firm believer in a strategic planning process being data-driven. We look at everything from student demographics to faculty and staff demographics. We look through accreditation reports, any data we can get our hands on to help us get a handle on where this institution is. And also have some conversations around, where the institution is. And part of that comes with that SWOT analysis. And here we're typically looking at engaging a variety of stakeholders around what is the institution doing well? What could the institution do better? And whether we're talking about institution, department, unit, you can do the same thing for all of them. And you need to engage stakeholders in multiple kinds of ways. We typically do some surveys of faculty, staff, students, alumni, the business community, partners and friends, interviews. If you have a board of trustees, we typically interview all of the trustee members. So we look at everything, the governance level, as well as the administrative and academic operations level. How would you advise institutions to develop in their pool of key stakeholders? I would advise you to do it very, very carefully, extremely carefully. You want stakeholders that have a diversity of opinions about the institution. In fact, I always like to include at least one or two critics, to be perfectly honest with you, because sometimes they can be more candid with you than some others. But students should be included as stakeholders. Also, alumni should be included as stakeholders. The interesting thing about some of our alumni, and again, I tend to be brutally honest and candid. Some of our alumni have very loud voices. They'll call the president, they'll call the board of trustees about whatever the issues are, and make a whole lot of fuss, but they don't go to school no money and expect to be listened to. That's a dynamic that needs to be changed. I tell alumni, ante up, ante up. But yeah, but you also want to engage and particularly if you're a public institution, you need to engage key policymakers. You need to engage key policymakers. One of the mistakes that our institutions tend to make is that we don't know how to work both sides of the aisle. We don't know how to work both sides of the aisle. Give you an example. I'm currently working with FAMU on their strategic plan. We're doing something that's called a landscape assessment. Part of that is engaging stakeholders. So I've had conducted interviews with the Florida Board of Governors, which is our state university system governing body. But I've also spent some time with the governor of the state of Florida's chief of staff that does their post-secondary stuff. I've also spent time with the chairs of the Senate Higher Education Appropriations Committee, the House Chair of the Higher Education Appropriations Committee. I've spent some time with a couple of FAMU alums who are in the legislature. And so you have to engage stakeholders at this level, because the thing I found is they tend to be brutally candid and honest with you. They tend to be brutally candid and honest with you. You know, I interviewed the head of the Kreiser, who's the chair of BOG here in Florida. And he made the startling admission. I said, what would you like to be true about FAMU in 5 or 6 years and not true today? He said that the HBCU go away. Yeah, he actually told me that. Yeah, he cleaned it up a little, but I was astounded, and I shared that with President Robinson and some others. But so yeah, that's very important. And then you get to the real where the rubber meets the road, and that's the planning phase. Prioritizing those strategic priorities, and for me, strategic means if you don't address will impact your ability to achieve that student success at the end of the day. And so from that, reaching consensus on those priorities, developing some goals and objectives and performance indicators, and then actually writing a document. And then the implementation, extremely critical. Same with the evaluation. And the implementation and evaluation need to be continuous processes. But you've also got to socialize the plan with the entire campus community. They ought to know that the planning process is taking place. They ought to know how they can intentionally engage in the planning process, and their voices are going to be heard. Because ultimately, they're the ones that got to implement this, to be honest with you. And that's where that acceptability comes into place. And if you start socializing them early on, they're more likely to have buy-in. We typically set up a strategic planning website where folks can ask questions, access information. We try to make the topic from the very beginning to the very end, how we get from point A to point B, how they can intersect with the plan, how they can provide input. And pre-COVID, we would spend a lot of time on campus, just engaging people informally as well as formally. We would do focus groups with faculty and students. We would do interviews. I would spend a lot of time in the student unions, sitting and talking with students and staff, and going on campus in the evening, because college camp on our institutions in the evening, they're a whole different. You got a whole different ball game going on, to be honest with you. So we'll spend time in the evening in the student center, shooting pool with students, pants off them. And you get a chance to engage folks in a much different way. I've even popped in the classroom. I sat in on some classes, some labs, all of that. And you just get a different flavor, if you will, by doing those kinds of things. And it adds to the richness of the strategic planning process. So that's sort of the overview. But yeah, I agree. Yeah. But thank you. Go to the next slide, Dr. Lampkin.
For some reason, I'm having issues moving it forward. Just a second, I'm sorry. So I'm going to move us to the next. Oh, here we are. I'm going to move us to the next slide. And then as we talk about this, I want us to keep in the back of our minds for the last few minutes, how are we implementing this in our campuses that Dr. Seaman just took us through the process? So what does that look like for your institutions as it relates to enhancing cultural competency? So we'll have Dr. Seaman take a few minutes here. And so you're thinking about this to prepare for our final minutes to talk about what you're doing. Dr. Seaman?
In other words, I need to wrap it up, huh? Okay. Environmental.
No, Dr. Seaman.
Environmental scan. PEST. That's not a roach. PEST stands for political, either economic and environmental, social, and technological factors. All organizations are impacted by PEST factors, whether you're a public organization, private organization. All organizations are impacted by PEST factors. Political can be anything from budgets, and particularly when it comes to appropriations. You know, one of the things that I tell public organizations is that you have to look at appropriations in terms of a pie. And there are only so many slices in that pie. And the extent to which you get a fair share or a reasonable share of that pie, quite frankly, depends on what I call political juice. If you got political juice, you're gonna get yours. And if you don't have political juice, you're not gonna get yours. I talked to 12 or 13 years at Florida State University. They also did some adjunctive FAMU. And one of the things that and the disparities were so great, you know, I would tell my colleagues at FAMU, you know, we'll put up a building on FSU's campus and they'll pay a parking lot over FAMU. And the disparity was that great, you know, but that has to do with the political realities. And they change over time. They change over time. And then you've got the economic and environmental factors. You've got the social factors and that whole cultural competency thing that we've been talking about earlier is a part of it. And then the technology. And we saw the importance of that during the pandemic, you know. Some institutions were able to not miss a beat, others struggled. And in fact, one of the things that I encourage all institutions to do is to develop what we call an instructional continuity plan. An instructional continuity plan so that things keep clicking the way they ought to click, regardless of whether it's a pandemic or a sandemic or something else. Okay. So I'm done.
Alrighty. Thank you. So this was some principles that Dr. Seaman talked about in terms of the parameters. Again, bold and visionary, having a mission, inclusive and transparent. I want us to use our final few minutes, because I want to be respectful of our time, to talk about what is employing a culturally responsive framework or lens means for planning and implementing institutional initiatives, with a particular focus on your strategic planning. I was taking copious notes, as I always am, and Dr. Seaman was talking about opportunities for implementation, what makes us unique as institutions, and also these experiences, the different expectations and of learning environments for our students. And so I want us to use that information and talk about what does this look like? All of this we've talked about as it relates to enhancing cultural competency for our students on our campuses. Any takers on that? I know that was a big picture, but if we're using strategic planning to engage and to enhance our campuses with this framing in mind, what does it look for? Can someone give me a couple look fors? Because we know what the evidence says, but if we're on our campuses, what should we be looking for? Whether it be at the preparation, assessment, planning, implementation, or evaluation.
I think one of the things that
open it up for questions. Go ahead.
I think one of the things that we ought to be looking for is something that Dr. Seaman mentioned early on, and that is inclusivity. Are we including all of the voices that ought to be heard, and particularly are we including those who would not normally be heard, the underserved? And I believe that's quite important. The other thing is that we have to be realistic. A second point that I really latched on to, Dr. Seaman, is that um, this is a living document, and a living document has to be able to be adjusted, has to be able to be changed when necessary. So when we find that something is missing, a piece is missing, a voice is missing, we've got to be able to be in a position to make that strategic change so that inclusion is part of the reality.
Yeah.
Very good point, sir. Thank you very much for those very wise points.
Others? Thank you, Dr. Lee, and thank you for really touching on, particularly in terms of inclusivity. Others?
Can I piggyback off of the comment that Dr. Lee made and just add to it?
Mm-hmm.
I think that some of the things that we might want to start focusing on as HBCUs in the future is this thing of being inclusive. I know that previously and in some circles, the HBCUs serve that purpose for the underserved community. I think that as we have all had this reckoning that America wants to call it at this point, we've now moved into this phase to where there should be, as Dr. Seaman said, we have to be able to communicate across the aisle. And maybe perhaps we start looking at some partnerships in places where we in the past may not have thought there were partnerships to further move that vision of HBCUs to that next level. What I always tell students is that because you are here, that does not mean that you cannot have a Harvard-like experience.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know Dr. Seaman is going to talk about this, but I just have to say this. Partnerships matter. And this is why we are here. And I'm excited to hear that. And I'm going to let Dr. Seaman have the last word as it relates to this. So we respect our time.
Thank you so much for those comments. And really, what you get at is what does the 21st century HBCU look like? What does the 21st century HBCU look like? And both the opportunity and the challenge is to how can we retain the historical aspects of HBCU, but also move into the 21st century? And that's a real challenge on some of our campuses, but that's what we need to get to. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that comment.
Yeah. Thank you so much, all of you. I want to be respectful of time, but what I do want to say, and thank you, Dr. Seaman. This was a really robust, rich discussion. When we ended it with Dr. Seaman said, what does a 21st century HBCU look like? I'm so excited to say that Our partners here have been a part of an edited volume that should be coming out very soon, where we are engaged in those discussions. Our voices are being heard, and we highlight the importance of the partnership and what we've been able to do together. And so I'd like to say and end on that note of saying, thank you all for being a part of the work that we're doing. And we are a part of those conversations and thinking about where we're moving next in terms of this idea about partnerships. It's real sexy. I've been using this term, for lack of a better word, to partner with HBCUs right now. But what does it look like? And what are we asking of our partners that are partnering with us to make sure that we are a part of the conversation and that we are moving our institutions forward? So thank you for being here. There is a link in the Dropbox that I need everybody to go to now, not later. Take a few minutes now, please, 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 to complete, to talk about this session so that we can continue to do this work. Again, thank you for being here. It is 11:01, but please take a minute to use the Dropbox. Dr. Seaman, any final words, or any of our partners, any final words before we?
No, it's just been a pleasure spending the morning with you all. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Does everyone have the link? Can you see the link in the chat? And I can email it to you individually if need be.
Email it to me, Tabitha.
Okay, Dr. Smith. Anybody else would like me to email it directly to you? If so, I see the head shaking. If you drop your email in the Dropbox, I know some of you already. Dr. Lee, I already have you. I just sent it. I will drop it in the box for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Looking forward to another great 5 years.